Norberg is our moderator, and we'll begin.
Yeah, we've been, is this on? Yes? No? Now? Oh, yes. Yeah, we've been talking e-trade here for 2 days, and it is part of trade. And so this session is about how we regulate it and how we move around trade agreements and touch on these issues. We have a large number of bi- and multilateral free trading agreements going on, and two of them, the TTIP and the TPP, have both been described as new and 21st century in very different ways. And so we're going to touch on those issues. So we're going to let Sandy go first.
Great. Well, Hannah, thanks very much, and good morning, everybody. I'd first like to thank the sponsors, GW and Susan, and the World Bank for really putting together a first-class conference. I think the representation on the panels and the scope of the panels has been quite impressive. So hopefully you'll think the same thing after this panel is done, but we'll see. Just a word at the beginning on Akamai, which is my company. It's not a consumer-facing business, so you might not know what it is. We are what is classified as a content distribution network, which is a complete misnomer because we have none of our own content and we don't have a network. However, we do have our customers are content providers of all types, media companies, app providers, enterprises, and we have to work closely with infrastructure companies, telecom infrastructure companies. We have a system of servers deployed around the globe, 200,000 servers. We pre-position content close to the user, and we use algorithms to help suggest the appropriate routing for that. So we relieve congestion on the internet. Our tagline is that we make the internet fast, reliable, and secure, which I try to boil down to say just we make the internet work better. So hopefully when you're having a good experience on the internet, that's because of Akamai, and if you're having a bad experience, it's somebody else is doing. I don't know. So getting to the point, I guess the tagline for this conference in total is the end of trade as we know it, question mark at the end. If you've been following the presidential campaign in the United States, maybe we should just shorten that to the end of trade declaration, because I think the presumptive nominees in both parties now have come out with very strong positions. It's probably the most negative general environment for trade and trade agreements in the United States that I can certainly remember in about 3 decades of being involved in this. There was a leak this morning that Hillary Clinton just announced that she wouldn't favor a lame duck vote on TPP either. So it'll be interesting to see what happens now. So, maybe if it's the end of trade, we can just kind of pack up the panel and go home, and somebody else can worry about these difficult questions. But it is incumbent on us to try to dig into some of these issues. So I'd like to start my presentation with a question to the audience, just by a show of hands. So if you could raise your hand, whoever in the audience thinks that they're perfect, please raise your hand. Excellent. I've never got a different answer, but I've always wanted to meet someone and have a chance to talk to that person. This is a newsflash. Trade agreements are not perfect either. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is not a perfect trade agreement. And it's not clear to me that that's the standard that it should be held to. I'm going to talk a little bit about the TPP. I think Damien and some others will bring in some of the other agreements. But this is the agreement that's been negotiated that has digital provisions in it now. It's the agreement that may be up for consideration. It may be the first agreement that's put in place. We'll see. But we need to keep in mind for something like the TPP agreement, it's the product of negotiation from 12 sovereign nations. I'm sure if you asked each of those countries, there's some things they like about the agreement, there are other things they don't like about the agreement, but in total, on balance, they thought it was in their best interests. In the United States, we'll see if Congress agrees, and all the other trading partners need to go through their own individual processes to approve that. But trade agreements are complex documents, and I think when we're getting into these, and there's some consideration, there's always a pointing out of the things that a trade agreement lacks. And to me, it's really, when you're evaluating these things in general, it's a two-step process. Number one, is it a net positive? Are you better off after the trade agreement than you were before the trade agreement? Maybe it has things you don't like. Maybe its copyright term is too long or too short. Maybe the agricultural elimination of tariffs is too much or too little. But on balance, is this something that is beneficial? And if the answer to that is yes, then if it's up for consideration, are there things that can be done to improve it in a reasonable period of time? Or is this the best that can be done for now, and improvements will have to wait for a later agreement? Just turning to the substance of TPP for a second, I think we've gone over that this is not a perfect agreement. We're in favor of it, but there are things in there that we would have liked better. But I think in talking about digital trade, it is in many ways a groundbreaking agreement. It has provisions in it regarding digital trade that we think, as both for our business and frankly for free expression on the internet, are incredibly important. Just to mention a few, it is the first trade agreement to make an obligatory obligation to allow cross-border data flows. Now, there are exceptions to that. I'm sure we'll hear that from some of the other panelists, but there is a requirement for governments to generally allow cross-border data flows. There's a provision against forced localization of servers. So many of you, all of us, I think at this point, we use the cloud. We keep our photos in the cloud, we keep our music in the cloud, we keep our correspondence in the cloud, and even our business applications in the cloud. In order for that to be done efficiently, that needs to, a company needs to decide where and how they deploy their servers to be able to most efficiently do that. If everyone has to put servers in every country in order to have a cloud, it's not a very efficient system, and you really lose the benefits of cloud technology to start with. And then the third thing I'd point out is there is a prohibition, at least for mass market software, regarding forced transfers of source code. That's something that is certainly intellectually property related, but it's important for those of us who make our lives in software. We'd like to make sure that that stays secure. Now, it probably doesn't cover Akamai software because we don't do mass market software, but at least it's a start. I think some of the other panels probably dealt with how important digital trade is generally. Just a couple of statistics, not to get over in great detail, but the International Trade Commission did a report. I'm getting the time to wrap up, so I'm going to talk very fast now. Trade has added 3 to 4% of U.S. GDP in 2011. Very important. Last words about process and where we go in the future. I think you'll hear from some of the other panelists that this thing was negotiated in secret. And somehow it should all be put to the side because it's undemocratic. I don't think it's been negotiated in secret, and I don't think we should be negotiating these in the public square, and happy to address those questions on that later. To the future, we've really got to take a look at, is this something that moves the ball forward in a world in which free movement of goods and services on the internet is under attack, in which free expression is under attack on the internet? This may not be a perfect agreement, but we need to have a model that's a counterweight to what some other countries are doing to restrict internet access and internet expression. Thank you.
Yeah, Susan told me that I have to be very strict on time, and yeah, yeah. Otherwise, I'll get it from her later. So, yeah. So you left off at a great place there with transparency, which I think is a great clue for Damien to come in and talk about the TTIP from the European.
Thank you. Since this is the election season, I thought I would structure my talk around PAC, P-A-C. A few words on process, a few words on architecture. Where do we agree, what disciplines, what rules, and content? What is it that we want to negotiate? What is it that we think we need to agree among nations to ensure that we have the infrastructure in place for trade flows and electronic flows to prosper. So I would say, is it the end of trade negotiations as we know them? Well, traditionally, trade negotiations were taking place in closed rooms, and on the European side, we would obtain a mandate from our member states, now 28 member states. We would have constant interaction with the member states, also with the European Parliament. But that was not enough. That was not enough. There was, in particular, because of the negotiations with the United States, the TTIP, there was a strong request by the public opinion in Europe that we should do more. We should be much more transparent and, in a way, embed or anchor a bit more trade policy into our values. The number one being democracy, and so the traditional way of our democratic system or institutional setting to work with the Council and the Parliament was deemed insufficient. We needed to be much more transparent, engaging much more with the public as well, directly, in order to have a result which is better but also is acceptable. So therefore, since last October, we've decided to publish all our negotiating mandates, publish all our legal texts in trade negotiations, and explanation, because if you read these texts, well, guess what, they're hard to understand. And also publish round reports. So we've increased tremendously. I think the level of transparency, I would say we have a kind of a new paradigm governing the way we negotiate with partners. Now, obviously, it can cause frictions if the other party doesn't have the same level of transparency, like we've seen this week, I think, with the leaks in the TTIP. But I think we go forward and we'll continue with the process, the new paradigm, another P, which we have started to build as of last fall, basically, with the new trade commissioner, Cecilia Malmström. I'm sure the fact that she's Swedish, like Hanna, has actually helped us shifting to that new paradigm. Architecture, where is it that we think we should negotiate rules on e-commerce, rules facilitating data flows, and all the issues that go around it. And there are many, as we've heard earlier today and yesterday. Well, from a European perspective, when we deal with global issues, the best solution, the first best solution is obviously multilateral solutions. Now, there was a work plan on e-commerce in the Doha round, which started in the late 90s, as you know, but didn't get us very far. And, well, I guess also the Doha round in itself didn't get very far. So multilateral solutions, I think, extremely tricky. And so the second best is then on the global stage, plurilateral agreements. That's what we've been doing with TISA, the trade agreement in services, environmental goods agreement, EGA, or the ITA, where we've dealt with tariffs in IT technology, the ITA 2, as we say it. What's important from our perspective is that still what we do plurilaterally should be anchored in the plurilateral trading system. And so therefore, MFN provisions, non-discrimination, are really important. And using the dispute settlement of the WTO is essential. So, as you know, we've been negotiating the TISA agreement with 22 other GATT members or WTO members. And so we hope that will continue. And then anything we agree there, hopefully, can serve as a source of inspiration for a multilateral agreement. It's nothing that we would impose on the other partners, but that's certainly a source of inspiration. And then the third best, if you want, is bilateral agreements. TPP, Sandy has talked about it. We've concluded an agreement with Canada, the CETA agreement, which I think is a modest step towards a full-fledged chapter on e-commerce and telecom. TTIP, and of course our other negotiations, EU-Japan. So that's my third point. C, content. What is it that we actually negotiate in these agreements? On telecom, we think we have to have independent regulators. We need to have disciplines on how licenses are given or not given, transparency of the regulatory regime. Another issue, of course, on non-discriminatory access to telecom networks, and what are the conditions for access? That's for telecom. If you want to look at something we've agreed with the United States in 2011, we agreed the so-called ICT principles, which we try to then use in other agreements with our bilateral agreements that we both have with third countries. And then e-commerce. Well, on e-commerce, the issues are, though, the things that we try to do is basically improve and ensure that data flows and e-commerce services can actually flower, but in a trustworthy environment so that consumers get the right level of protection against spamming, that contracts can be concluded electronically, that e-trust services, authentication services are provided and will not be disputed. We also want to have provisions on net neutrality, although I understand it's a highly sensitive issue. And then data flows and localization of computing facilities. You know the situation in the European Union where we said we want to have first the data protection regulation in place and second the privacy shield adopted before we can then actually negotiate data flows. But any commitment we would take in as regards to data flows, I mean, cannot undermine our data privacy rules. I mean, that's quite clear. We said that all along, and trade agreements are not the vehicle to, or the forum to negotiate rules on data privacy. I think I'll stop here. I probably managed to keep within the 7 minutes and look forward to a great debate. Thank you.
Great time-keeping skills there, Damien. Kudos for that. Nicholas from Google, we're going to leave it to you because you're the big enabler of all of this. One of.
One of many.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
yeah,
not too many, but.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Susan, for hosting this conference. This is just a great opportunity, I think, to come together with academia, civil society, business, and just come together and think about what trade should mean for the coming century. And I think when we think about digital trade, well, I don't know. If you close your eyes and think about the word trade, despite being in a room surrounded by the word digital trade, I think the image you still see is probably one of a container ship passing through the Panama Canal. Or if you search on Bing or Google for trade, that's what shows up first, is a whole bunch of container ships navigating ports around the world, moving to large warehouses and shipping goods. But while you close your eyes, you're probably also very close to your smartphone or your tablet or your laptop, which has tens of thousands of ports on it. The internet it connects people via ports. There are 65,000 potential ports on a given device, and these ports are what enable the new form of trade that we're trying to talk about today. I think this idea that data flows, which were practically non-existent 20 years ago, now contribute more to global economic growth than the flow of goods. That's a huge change, and I think we're all sort of struggling to figure out what trade should do in response to this huge change. You have over 3 billion internet users, and you've seen 45 times growth in cross-border bandwidth in the past decade alone. And we're like to see much more than that in the coming years as well. So what does the growth of the internet mean for trade? We've heard a lot of great stats, I think, over the past day or so. The World Bank's report showed that when internet usage is high, trade between two countries increases by about 10% or so. And when internet usage is low, trade decreases by about 9%. If you're a small business and you use the internet, you're about 50% more likely to export. If you use eBay, as Usman could tell you, you're about 95% more likely to export than a company that does not use the internet. And the internet has accounted for a huge percentage of GDP growth in the past 15 years, 21% of GDP growth in the past 5 years, outpacing utilities and agriculture. And this isn't just a business issue, too. If you're an academic, you're increasingly collaborating across borders on your articles and on your work. Collaboration on academic papers increased from 9% to 30% in the past 20 years. So that means if you're an author, you're very likely to have a co-author who is not from your country. The web also depends upon the Apache Web Server, which is an open source project that spans the world and has developers from around the world contributing on a daily basis and improving how the internet works. Even on social media, on Facebook, I think 16% of your friends now are from a different country. On Twitter, 26% of all followers are international. What does this mean for Google? Google is also benefiting and I think enabling trade for a lot of small businesses and everyday people, really, too. App and game developers in Google Play earned $7 billion in the last year alone by serving over 1 billion customers in 180 countries. On YouTube, we've paid out about $3 billion on YouTube and Google to the music industry alone. And the thing about YouTube, too, is that YouTube is an export platform. 60% of all views of a video on YouTube come from outside of the home country of the person who created the video. So YouTube is primarily, a majority of the views on YouTube are exports in that sense. And people think of YouTube as a platform for cat videos, but it is really a business platform as well. You have musicians and artists and game developers and many others making livings increasingly on YouTube, and people building global brands. So Variety recently surveyed teenagers to ask who their favorite celebrity was, who the most important celebrities were in their lives. And I think of the 20 or so that were listed, all but 3 got their start on YouTube. So this is changing culture and sort of reversing the trade flows we think of, I think, because it's enabling people to start from nowhere and reach that audience instantly. And if you're a small business, of course, you can use tools like Global Market Finder or AdWords on Google to find new markets for your stuff around the world and to find out who's searching for your stuff and target as appropriately to them. And this generates a huge amount of economic activity. In the US alone, search and advertising tools generated about $131 billion of economic activity on an annual basis. This is, so things are changing, obviously, and I think we all recognize that these stats mean something. Of course, the stats aren't perfect, and we need better stats, honestly, on a lot of these issues. A lot of it is just trying to guess, what's changing, and so there's a lot of space to sort of think about more broadly what the internet impact is. But I think in the trade concept, we really need to think about how trade policy can both sort of reflect and enable this new world. And sorry, one other point. My daughter is watching this right now on live stream from BC, and my mom is watching it from Italy. So these things aren't they're not captured in any trade stats anywhere, of course, but they are connecting us in new ways. And when we think about just the e-commerce side of trade, I think we miss that sort of broader picture of the internet's enabling role for broader communications, for facilitating trade in that sense. So, hi, Addie. So what do we need from trade to keep up with this changing environment? I think the IP panel actually yesterday was really interesting. There was a lot of sort of back and forth, and I think folks tend to have pretty set positions on these issues, but there was also some degree of consensus, I think, on the idea that, a well-functioning copyright system should include some degree of balance and some degree of limitations and exceptions. Now, in the US, these limitations and exceptions are framed as fair use, and fair use, created the growth of the US consumer electronics industry over the last 20 years. The VCR, digital video recorders, iPods, cloud computing, search engines, social media, 3D printing, machine learning, and lots of other sort of applications are all heavily dependent upon the idea that of fair use. And so the idea of trying to figure out how to sort of include this within the framework that trade exports to the rest of the world and figure out consensus provisions on these ideas. TPP is a great first step in this direction. And of course, trade is a slow-moving ship. But there's lots of ways in which we can now build upon this, including at the implementation stage of TPP. Lots of countries are considering new rules around copyright, and I think it's very important to think about how we can actually use the TPP in a positive way to push for balanced IP. The other sort of 2 big policy priorities, as Anupam mentioned earlier, intermediary liability protections, the idea that when someone is uploading content onto a service, and when you're running a service like YouTube, which has 400 hours of video being uploaded every minute, the idea that you might be hauled into court whenever a user does anything questionable, that it would be a pretty significant impediment to launching a service. And this is why we need these kinds of rules within trade, because these are platforms that are being used for exports, and increasingly we need to think about the ways in which trade can harmonize around these ideas. And finally, the free flow of data. This is typically brought up in the context of data localization, which is a critical sort of thing for trade to address. But it's also important to think about data flows more broadly, and here I mean things like site blocking. The idea that you can block an entire service within Pakistan just for a few pieces of bad content on it. You need proportionate remedies, and you obviously need ways to address harms that are happening online. But the idea that you just shut down an entire service, or for that reason, or for other sort of data access reasons, is deeply problematic. And I think it'd be great to have a broader conversation about what the free flow language means beyond sort of the ways in which it's being invoked so far. And so this is the substance. I guess I'd make one quick point on transparency. Yes, I'm sure Jeremy will talk, and Carolina will talk much more about that. But just as the internet transforms who participates in trade, I think you need to think about who participates in trade policy. The problem is, we still don't have a negotiating process where all internet stakeholders are at the table. This is not just like the right thing to do, but it is the right thing to do, obviously. You need expert voices in the room. You need engineers, folks from civil society who have thought about this a lot, like positively engaged and tactically engaged on developing these trade frameworks. And so I think it's important, both for sort of the trade policymakers and for the civil society and company folks to actually come together and develop some positive proposals, which I think is what this conference is starting to sort of outline, is what is this framework that we all think of as so critical to digital trade, and how can we better reflect it within our agreements. And I think there have been problems in the past with the process around trade, but key players are increasingly highlighting that changes need to be made, that we need to increase participation, increase transparency. And I think it's time to seize this opportunity. We have EFF put out a great set of recommendations several months ago on transparency. You have a lot of other sort of powerful voices making the same kind of arguments. So let's think about this today, and let's think about this in the future too, as to how to get new folks into the room and make sure trade is reflecting the voices of all 3 billion internet stakeholders out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicholas. I can see that you're a first mover and you have the first mover advantage, so you realize what you could use this for, saying hi to family members. Anyone else who would like to take the opportunity? Carolina, you want to say hi to Noah?
That's cool now.
Yeah, we sent our kids to school.
Education, I don't know. Critical analog component of trade, actually.
All right,
She's
Jeremy.
in her computer lab now, come on.
Jeremy, you're up.
Thanks, Hannah. And the end of Nick's presentation was a really good lead into what I'm going to say about some of the most obvious discrepancies between the practice of trade negotiation and the rhetoric of the negotiating partners, particularly concerning digital issues. Because the United States and Europe, and most of their trading partners, in fact, have made very firm commitments to develop internet-related public policies using a multi-stakeholder process. There are many statements about this that go back more than a decade, including congressional resolutions as well as declarations of the OECD, the Council of Europe, UNESCO, and other regional and international organisations. But the one that I usually come back to is the Net Mondial multi-stakeholder statement, which was concluded in April 2014 and has since been incorporated into a number of other documents. And it provides the development of international internet-related public policies and internet governance arrangements should enable the full and balanced participation of all stakeholders from around the globe and made by consensus to the extent possible. Decisions must be easy to understand, processes must be clearly documented and follow agreed procedures, and procedures must be developed and agreed upon through multi-stakeholder processes. Now, it's readily apparent that these ideals are ignored in practice when it comes to the negotiation of internet-related public policies in trade agreements, including issues that are squarely internet governance issues, such as net neutrality, spam control, cross-border data transfers, domain name disputes, and so on. Now, apart from the fact that all the parties concerned have committed to deal with these issues through multi-stakeholder processes rather than through closed, opaque trade negotiation processes, there are also really good reasons why it would be a good idea for these negotiations to be more open. So let me break down just 3 of those. Firstly, democracy. The democratic legitimacy of a country's government obviously only extends to rules that it makes for its own citizens. Because the internet's a network that crosses borders, it's difficult to prevent national rules from spilling over those borders and impacting those who aren't represented by the decision makers. And even multilateral agreements between governments don't capture the interests of non-state transnational networks of individuals, or obviously of the countries that are not part of those multilateral or plurilateral agreements. Second reason why it's a good idea to open up these agreements is subsidiarity and non-duplication, which simply means taking the decisions at the appropriate level and not duplicating functions that already exist in specialised bodies. In relation to the TPP, the best example of this is that we shouldn't be trying to set domain name policy where this has a perfectly good home at ICANN and in the national level equivalents of ICANN. And the third reason is expertise, and I think Nick already made this point, that simply put, the trade negotiators don't have the deep expertise on internet-related issues that they need to cover these issues adequately. We've seen this in the TPP's provisions on encryption and software source code, for example. The US Trade Representative is stacked with people who know intellectual property, at least from the US rights holders' perspective, but the internet governance people, even within the US administration, are missing and are kind of sidelined. So these are just three very good reasons, ranging from the theoretical to the very practical, why we need to do something about this disconnect between the commitments that the US government has made on multi-stakeholder internet governance and the practice about how trade negotiations are still conducted. So since this problem is so very obvious to most of us, being stakeholders from civil society, from the private sector, from the academic and technical communities, and even from government, what can we actually do about it to bring trade negotiation practices in line with these multi-stakeholder process norms? Well, this is one of the questions around which my organisation, EFF, brought together 30 participants back in January to a strategy meeting on catalysing reform to trade negotiation processes. And a number of folks in this room were at that meeting. We intended to set an agenda for the participants to collaborate towards the reform of closed and captured trade negotiation processes that deal with internet and digital policy issues. One of the first visible outcomes of that meeting was a document called the Brussels Declaration on Trade and the Internet, which you can get a copy of outside. So if you haven't seen this before, please get a copy from the desk outside. And then one of the longer term outcomes has been the establishment of a new open digital trade network, which is a platform for trusted allies to collaborate on joint actions towards the reform of these trade negotiation processes. And some of the strategies that we're either already collaborating on through that platform or that we're planning on doing so include hosting a session at the WTO Public Forum on the multi-stakeholder model and on transparency of trade negotiations. Also developing positive text proposals on e-commerce, data localization and other internet topics for the TISA negotiations. And advocating for the inclusion of a main session on the internet and trade agreements at the Internet Governance Forum. So you can find this new network online at opendigital.trade. It includes task tracking, a wiki, forums, and a shared contact database and calendar that are in development. It is a closed platform, so you won't find any publicly accessible information. But if you have the expertise and the interest to involve yourself, you can register there. And then if we know, once we establish who you are and that it's appropriate for you to join, we'll approve you to become part of that platform. So please do take a copy of the Brussels Declaration. Check out opendigital.trade and please spread the word to anyone who would be interested to participate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Also great timekeeping skills. Makes me look really good. Thank you. Carolina.
Sure. So first, thank you so much. Thank you for Susan for always keeping the dialogue open with all of us. You are always a great convener, and thank you for the World Bank to also support this initiative. I think the World Bank is a very important actor that provides both policy and data and expertise, not just for developing countries, but for all of us doing better our job. So, and here I'm referring to the digital dividends reports and a series of other reports that are so crucial for us to build our arguments upon. And I think the question that Susan posed for us, do provisions regulating digital trade need a rethink? And she asked me to summarize some of the broader jurisdictional questions and links with other substantive topics here, more or less addressed by other panelists. And a lot of the arguments I'm going to use here, please do take them as elements that are correlated and not caused by one another. So I just want to give that caveat, because in a lot of cases, we don't have all the information because, as Jeremy and other colleagues have pointed out, a lot of the negotiations are done in closed doors, of course with certain advisors, but to be part of that advisor group, there is a high barrier to enter to that. And that's another question for us to think. I think Jeremy addressed a lot. So digital trade has been part of trade policy discussions, at least since GATS. So beginning of 90s, mid of 90s. So it's not something new, and nowadays, but that discussion actually started with something that was close and known by the international organization by WIPO and WTO, that were more familiar topics, I mean. So, and that I refer to intellectual property rights. And since the 90s, and I have all that in my slide share, I can share with you guys those graphics, there was exponential growth of bilateral trade agreements exactly trying to level the playing field for the, at that time, increasing company sector that was the IP-based sector, and here I'm thinking about content and also software. So the clauses you see there that start appearing in trade that before were not, and there is a huge discussion in bibliography regarding if even intellectual property rights should be part of trade agreements because of the impact in freedom of expression and access to health and other issues. Are clauses related to ISP liability, informancing procedures, border procedures, etc. With more the traditional stuff when we think about piracy issues and cross-border issues. That has evolved, and again, here is the correlation, not the causation caveat, with the increased presence and boom of internet-based innovations and digital trade-based innovations. I have done a map with a colleague, Borjuk-Ilik, she's a highly published with many books scholar and advocate in this area, that since at least 2004 in the bilateral between Singapore and US, you have started seeing a series of new clauses in trade agreements that were not present or foreseen at the GATS time. So we have from regulating what I call the many layers of internet, if you use the Z-Trains model of 5 layers, from youth, so you have from the behavior layer to the content layer to the infrastructure layer. So you have from youth to privacy to online consumer protection issues to copyright varying from DRM to ISP liability, and actually even cybersecurity. When we talked about security on cross-border data and innovation in the cloud, and we haven't touched Internet of Things, but that actually also appears there with the increase of Internet of Things. All of that has been appearing in these bilaterals that try to level the playing field for these companies that are growing and becoming multilateral companies. But then the question I have to make, trying to rethink the trade agreements as we know it so far, if you actually analyze all of that language, you see an increasing presence, of course, of the power of developed countries, and I have a caveat, I'm from Brazil, not US, on how they are exporting some rules that are important for a lot of times they're incumbents, right? That in trade agreements become entrants in other countries. And that's an important caveat to say Public Knowledge launched a paper analyzing the impact and possible implementation of TPP in US, and that was a very focused analysis on US and conflict of TPP with US law. The analysis would be very different if done from the perspective of Malaysia or Vietnam or other developing countries where, again, are having to open the markets to big companies. And I'm not saying that's bad, because we see that on PayPal and eBay and other companies that actually create opportunities, and the Digital Dividend Report brings a lot of that. At the end of the day, I think the TPP is a very important tactic that was used to level the playing field. You see, if you actually map the bilaterals that were done, the bilaterals develop a huge net of agreements that then the TPP was coronating that strategy. A lot of the countries already had some commitments with the US with certain rules, and actually you see that impact now with RCEP. RCEP is the local Pacific trade agreements that involves China, and you see then Japan and South Korea actually pushing TPP rules to the RCEP. But I think at the end of the day, this all proves the complexity of the system we are dealing with here right now. And checking on my time. Oh, it's almost done. And I think one of the examples that most clarify that, besides intellectual property and besides the impact on freedom of expression that might have, is the cross-border data flow information issues. Anupan Chandra professor, he brought a bunch of other issues, but I think the cross-border is one of the most challenging ones because it deals with privacy, localization, freedom of expression, and censorship. But we have to actually take that complexity out and understand what's going on here. If a certain language is inserted in a certain chapter within a certain interpretation mechanism that's brought in another chapter, that's how you have to read it. When cross-border data flow is in the e-commerce chapter and not in a general chapter or certain other commitments, that is a e-commerce chapter. So we are not actually talking about freedom of expression. Has a lot of even the USTR used has a justification for the free flow of information. Can I have 1 minute more just to close? Well, Brazilians are never on time, right? So. So just going to the end here, that I think it's something important. What I would like to pose for us to consider is there space, is there the need to actually slow down some conversations on trade agreements and even create these more democratic spaces that Jeremy was referring to? Why I say that? Because those crucial pillars that so many of the other speakers brought about, including Usman, who did an amazing job summarizing all of them and calling attention for that. Should governments be spending time and coordination, intraministerial coordination to deal with digital literacy, entrepreneurship skills, and other things? So then when we do have the incumbents from developed countries being entrants in developing countries, we are ready for competition. And unfortunately, based on the other question about destruction earlier, history is a cycle of construction and destruction. We just need to ensure that people have the skills necessary to actually be creative, and if you have a business A destroyed, then you are able to create business B. So should we focus as a multi-stakeholder group in building those so necessary skills, and we're gonna so people can deal with the opening of their market. So that's a question for all of us. Trade is always faster. And the fact that TPP and a lot of the trade agreements now are being pushed through fast track is an example of that. Do we really need that? Is that something that's sustainable over time for development and growth? So anyway, that's a little bit of how I'm rethinking all of these issues.
All right, thank you very much. This has been very insightful, and as Sandy hoped, I think it was pretty lively in terms of having different opinions. By the use of this particular chair, I have the monopoly of asking the first question. And I think I'm asking a question to which we don't have an answer here today, but I am interested in gathering the thoughts from this esteemed panel on the question. So in the previous section, Anupam and Usman both pointed to the importance of regulation and trust, which are both the pillars of trade and trade policy. And not only are we looking at a new world of trade, but in this session we're also talking about new trade policy. So what we see is that the universe is sort of turning itself inside out or upside down in terms of who are the drivers, the implementers, the stakeholders, in terms of who are the rule makers and the rule takers. And we traditionally have been doing trade negotiations from the top down. So it has been governments negotiating with input from stakeholders and less so in the past. But how do we go around this when we look at, so in terms of population, looking at like that, then Facebook is the largest country in the world. How do you handle something like that when it's no longer contained to one government to start with, and being then an American company that is working all across the globe and doing a lot of good, but who regulates that? And so that monopoly is sort of given over. And also we're looking to governments to say, well, you have to invite stakeholders. You have to make sure that everyone is in the room. Well, maybe, is that really their role anymore too? Or should that be coming from the ground up too? And it's not just talking about regulation and writing the rules, which also needs time, but also in terms of implementation. How do we do that? And I had an awesome conversation with Professor Andrea Renda at Duke and at CEPS, and he also pointed out to me something that I hadn't thought about, which is how do we go about enforcing this? It's not like regulation on a piece of meat or textile. That's something that we can see, but the knowledge that goes into, for example, the work that the platforms do, who knows who do you ask? So does this look right to you? Does this look up to code? Who's going to know? And even further, it's sort of the issue with the iPhone, right? The unlocking of the iPhone. Who has that sort of information? And even more, how do you enforce it? And who do you enforce it with when you have algorithms that run things? So that was my, question, just sort of, So just any input on that. And we'll open up the floor to other questions.
Why don't we let you get your question?
Oh,
Yeah, it was perfect. If I may, because also it makes a great connection to some other issues that Susan had asked me to address. So I think at the end of the day, we are trying to balance hard law with soft law. Trade agreements in general create hard binding law. That will depend if the negotiators don't play a little bit with the verbs, then maybe you have some non-binding clauses. But in general, it's hard law comparatively to a lot of the commitments that Jeremy was mentioning. And in a lot of cases, when you have a country like US that actually have not really implemented a series of human rights international agreements, they all become, through other initiatives like Global Connect, Freedom Online Coalition, and all the other work, much more principles and general commitments than anything else, right? So again, how can we balance those things and address the various different things you actually brought in your question to, depending on the place, the region, or even the business, or even the layer of internet we are talking about, they're gonna affect, because they're gonna affect very differently depending on what we are talking about. So that's just a general statement. A framework for your question.
I agree with Carolina. The fact that we have this problem now that you've identified, not really a problem, but this challenge that we have these global companies that no country is responsible for regulating, and we have this global network that no one country has responsibility over, is a problem that we've been grappling with for decades now already, and are really no closer to solving. So the World Summit on the Information Society, I guess, back in 2003 to 2005, was looking at this and really didn't come up with any answer. There was a lot of fear about the idea of innovating some new global regulatory body for the internet, and that's come up over and over again since then, with fears of the ITU perhaps rising to become this behemoth that takes over control of the internet, and certainly nobody wants that. But I think the answer probably lies more in the direction that Carolina indicated, where we can have globally applicable soft law principles or guidelines And I think Paul, in the closing session this afternoon from the Internet and Jurisdiction Project, also has got some insight into this. So we can look forward to hearing from him. But bodies like the Internet Governance Forum don't make rules or laws, but they can promote globally applicable public policy principles. So I think that is maybe a part solution to your problem.
Yeah, I would agree with what Carolina and Jeremy both said. I think having these international bodies to develop norms through a sort of iterative, evolving process is probably the best way to go about addressing tools of sort of global regulation. Now, I would push back on the question a bit. I think companies are definitely responsive to national regulators in a way that 10 years ago, many weren't. Just the nature of doing business around the world. And so I think sort of the challenge we face is how to accommodate the sort of increasing jurisdictionalization of the internet in a way that doesn't result in sort of the fragmentation or balkanization. So, and trade can be, I think, a really useful sort of metaphor or tool in many cases to bind countries together. And really, one of the best statements I've seen recently on this point actually came from UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, which put out a report on data flows and data protection that showed how you can accommodate those and how privacy is critical to the flow of data and vice versa. And so how do you develop interoperable frameworks to allow countries to tackle these issues together? I think UN bodies have a role to play, IGF and other sort of civil society bodies have a role to play, and it's a gradual process, but I think we're making progress.
Just a few thoughts. As regards the monopoly of regulators, I think in a way, traditionally, either you regulate the companies, the actors itself in a sector, like you would do with banks, and you have 4I's principle. You want to make sure those who run the bank are fit and satisfy a number of minimum criteria, or you just regulate the activities to make sure that on liability, on data privacy, some other and all legitimate public policy objectives or reasons that you have out there are complied with. And I think trade agreements do not modify the regulatory architecture at all. We just want to make sure, for example, if you go back to the ICT principles, that the regulatory framework that is in place satisfies best practices, that we have independent regulators and not a regulator that is completely governed by a political party. We want to have transparent legislation. We want to know what are the rules of the game. And so trade agreements can be useful to raise a bit the level playing field and in that. As regards the implementation and enforcement and soft law versus hard law, if you look at Chorus, for example, it's a best endeavor clause on data flows, and so that has evolved over time. In TPP, it's certainly hard law with exceptions. And so trade agreements can be used to have both. You can have commitments that are subject to dispute resolution and then eventually trade sanctions, or just consultation process, the traditional diplomatic way of solving disputes between countries. So I think it offers a variety of enforcement options which are out there, and I'm sure we can probably invent some more if we listen to experts. Thanks.
Maybe just a couple of comments very quickly. And I would agree with most of Damien's comments. I would just recast one in a slightly different way. This notion of cross-border jurisdiction has been around for decades, if not centuries, right? We're talking about, he mentioned banks, airlines, telephone companies. They all have products that go international. We've managed, maybe sometimes well, maybe sometimes not so well, to deal with that. So while I think in many things with the internet, the scale and scope of the issue, the urgency of the issue may have increased, I think the precise nature of the issue, maybe it's not so different from a business issue we've been dealing with for a long time now. Just one comment, if I may, on one thing that Carolina said, raising this issue of maybe trade agreements are going too quickly. Maybe we need to slow the process down. Just for the benefit of people in this room, the TPP took 8 years to negotiate. It was concluded.
We were there.
It was concluded in November, signed in February, I believe. Who knows when it's going to go into effect? Everybody in this room is very familiar with technology. Technology changes very quickly. And if TPP or trade is looked at as the fast option here, well, oh my goodness, what is the slow option? And just to go back, one of our concerns, and I hopefully shared by others on the panel, is if we could all agree we're all reasonable people, free expression is important, not everyone signs on to all these mom and apple pie ideals about the internet, and we're seeing a lot of other models come into play now that are restricting free access to information, that are restricting freedom of expression, that are restricting the ability to access websites and to use your device on the internet. I think we need to move faster, not more slowly at this point.
All right, we're going to go to the floor and collect some questions. Yeah, let's start. Michael?
Right. Yeah. So we mentioned that the trade policy making process isn't completely open to the general public, but it's not quite completely closed either. And something that people are not aware of is that in the U.S. system, USTR is surrounded by this series of trade policy advisory committees. And I just went to their website, and there are 20 individuals that sit on the one which is responsible for trade negotiations. And I presume they actually have privileged access to the text during the negotiations. And of those individuals, which include some labor unions and others, I find at the moment the Software Alliance, the Information Technology Industry Council, Etsy, and since we've been talking about Payments All Conference, also MasterCard. And so I'm wondering what works about this process, what doesn't, and whether some of the private sector folks feel that you actually have an effective form of indirect representation in the process.
No, we'll collect. Yeah, we had about half an hour, so maybe we can do 2 or 3 rounds if we go this way.
So, it's Mark McCarthy with the Software and Information Industry Association. It's a question for Damien. It's about TTIP. The negotiations were going on in New York recently. I wonder if there's any update you can give us on the prospects and in particular the likelihood of cross-border data flow provisions being included.
Anyone who hasn't asked a question yet? In the back, over there?
Hi, Martin Molinuevo from the World Bank. I think it's for Damien, but I'll be welcome the opinion from anybody. Well, if we're thinking about regulations, in this case of e-commerce, and picking up on the privacy discussion that we had before, it's like, yeah, well, great. We can all agree that privacy is important. We can all agree that privacy can be used as a trade-off, as a restriction to trade and investment. But that's as far as trade agreements seem to recognize. So, and this is not only about privacy, it's most values, including the environment and so on, usually end up with a sort of economic needs, a necessity test for as the main provision on a trade agreement. So you can regulate on environment, you can regulate on anything, you can regulate on privacy, as long as that is not a disguised restriction to trade. And this is, in fact, more or less what TPP says on privacy. Is there any chance that trade agreements will evolve and go into a second step and take a more active regulation on what are the main principles that will govern, in this case, privacy? Or yeah, we are talking about privacy, so we'll keep it there. Thanks a lot.
This lady in second row. Yes.
This lady has a question. Rosemary?
We're going to start with someone who hasn't asked questions. There's been a load. No? Come on, don't be shy.
Hi, it's Moderator from Virginia. Now it works, yes. I'm Simone Franzi from Virginia Tech, and I have a question for all of you about the trade-off inclusion and exclusion, because as Nicholas was talking about before, the daughter is watching him from California, I guess, and the mom is watching from Italy. But it's not always true that everybody has access to internet content. If you go to Amazon, for example, you can buy things in the US, but the same things maybe are not available in other countries. The same for other companies or national broadcast system. They are not always available everywhere. And so my question is how trade policy can enable more trade and like include more people into having access to these contents, or exclude people maybe. I don't know. Thank you.
In the front there. Yeah, well, this is the last one.
Thank you. In reference to the TTIP, which is in contrast to the TTP, we're dealing with sophisticated market segments. And when they go on e-commerce, we have within the European Union seclusion of market segments already in the retail. So how does the TTIP now deal with this issue? For example, vitamins in Germany. Just as an example. Thank you.
Go ahead. You want to start left to right?
So addressing a couple of the questions, not all of them, of course, but in terms of, it's awesome when we bring amazing numbers, right? Numbers always gives us happiness and excitement because in general they are huge, and that's what a lot of times negotiators do believe in. And actually it's true. When I show a bunch of numbers of crowdsource-based innovation, the e-commerce and some other negotiators of TPP listen to me in the one of the rounds, I think was the Lisbon round. And, but at the same time, we need to then qualify those 8 years and that process. So thank you for the question on how the process works. The 8 years were comprised of a series of rounds that just a few people had access to the text and negotiation task. And it's difficult to deal with that text. If you guys saw the leakage from the TTIP that Greenpeace did Monday, I think, are so many brackets. So if you don't know how to read a text with brackets, it's actually almost impossible to read a trade agreement text and understand what's going on and what comes first or last. There are a series of political barriers to join the advisor committee, and that's why a lot of times they are company-based. So you have to be from a certain stakeholder, and you also have to sign a series of very high-level non-disclosure agreements to be part of that group that in a lot of times contradicts your own mission as a public interest organization composed by a bunch of lawyers. So there are a lot, so that's when I talked about barriers joining that. And at the end of the day, we need to ask ourselves what type of democracy we want, because at the end, our elected representatives were also excluded from seeing the negotiation text. I heard that from corridor mouth, Damien, so don't take me too serious, but if you want to be a European member of the parliament to access the current one of the TTP earlier texts or the US proposals, you would have to go to almost this bunker without your cell phone, without any of your advisors, to actually read some of the US proposals of that agreement. So that's what I heard from people in Brussels. And if you are a representative that have one of your core issues, environment, how are you gonna be able to understand the IP provisions without your assessor that's an expert on IP? So there are a lot of issues that qualify the 8 years and those advisors. So I just want to be sure that numbers are great, but we need to understand in which environment they sit on.
I don't have too much to add to that, except I agree, obviously, the reason why EFF is not on any of the trade advisory panels is we don't want to sign a non-disclosure agreement and then be barred from communicating what we've learned to our constituents. There are, however, I think, the trade advisory committees may be a good place to start when we're looking at reform and opening up. I mean, that's a starting point. So maybe we can look at how we can start to gradually open those up and make them more transparent, and bring some more faces in and lessen some of those restrictions. Europe has already started to make some transparency reforms, and Damien's referred to those. And I think if the USTR could match the reforms that the European Commission has brought in terms of the transparency of its proposals and access to those, then that would be a great place to start. So we're not looking at overhauling this immediately. I think incremental reforms are a fine way to go. But at the moment, the trade advisory system is not sufficient to provide what we're looking for these negotiations.
And a balance of views, right?
Mm.
I'll respond to a couple of the questions. On the Trade Advisory Council point, ITACs they're called. I think that is a great place to start. The idea that a pre-selected group of 15 to 20 people can predict all that's going to happen and be fully versed in assessing the sort of hard technical problems that increasingly arise in trade is, I think, a difficult question. So there are probably ways to think about providing, very temporary membership of one of those committees when a hard question comes up, or providing some other consultation process. Obviously, it's just not enough on its own to produce transparency and full participation. So I think you also have to look at the idea where trade agreements are creating rules, basically, rules that affect a broad set of the population, and figure out where, on those rule-based questions, that don't involve sort of quite as much or any sensitivity in some cases, how can you basically get input from the public via a notice and comment style process on those rules, and how can you, respond to those comments effectively? Just on the other question about sort of the trade-off, sort of inclusion versus exclusion question, and whether trade should address more of those questions. I think that's a great question. And I think it's sort of incumbent upon folks in this room and elsewhere to figure out what is the right framework for addressing increased access in trade agreements. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff you can do around spectrum, around sort of enabling abundant spectrum and sort of interoperable spectrum between different countries. That's the lifeblood of the internet and innovation these days. So that's one area to address. But I think there are important digital divide questions too that could be addressed within a trade framework, but haven't seen any great examples yet. Maybe you guys know of better ones.
I have a few questions. First of all, on the advisory groups, when we launched the TTIP negotiations, we were confronted with a situation where USTR has about 28, if not more, ITACs on this side, with experts in many areas. It's not one committee, it's actually 28. And they were also in the process of reforming and making a few changes to that. And we didn't have any advisory group on our side. We had civil society dialogues that we do either in general on all our trade negotiations or specifically on certain themes. And so we felt the need to set up an ad hoc advisory group for TTIP. And from day one, we thought that group, and I sat in all the meetings until I came over here a year and a half ago, we thought that group should be balanced, should be non-business organizations and should be business organizations, actually persons representing interests and not organizations. And it's quite a useful and interesting process to have in the same room the equivalent of US Chamber, which is someone from European business, and someone from the BEUC, the Consumer Association, the European Consumer Association, in the same room, and trade unions and farmers. So it's been very interesting to have this. And so the agendas are published in advance, the reports of discussions are published. So it's a pretty transparent process, which we developed. And so, and we published all our texts, particularly in the regulatory area. So we had to combine that with, indeed, reading rooms where documents coming from our partner in the United States are protected. And so that has been, if you want, the balance we had to strike between a lot of transparency and still confidentiality. Because we still think we need a minimum level of confidentiality, in particular market access issues, to actually strike a deal. And so, yes, people who certainly wanted to have access to the text have found this extremely problematic. But CETA text has been public for almost a year, will not be voted before the end of the year at the earliest, so people have a year and a half to look at the text and express their views and concerns to their members of the European Parliament, and then they'll vote and they'll form a judgment. TTIP prospect. Well, you've heard our the responsible trade commissioner and then Mark Froman saying, well, if we can do a deal this year, we'll do a deal this year. It has to be balanced, it has to be reasonable and ambitious. And we will, as I said, negotiate provisions on the cross-border data flows when we're done with the privacy shield, which should be adopted before the summer. So yeah, I mean, there's no reason to wait. I think 3 years, 3.5 years is plus a year and a half of preparations, and then another, 12, 18 months of ratification process. I don't think it's very fast. I would fully agree with what Sandy has said. On the question on privacy, I don't think privacy is a topic which you can, where the disciplines or the regulations that you have in place can be subject to an economic needs test. I would actually disagree with that. I think privacy and the right to privacy of personal data is a fundamental right in the European Union. So I don't think you can draw a parallelism between environmental regulation and the right to privacy of personal data. And from our perspective, we don't think trade agreements are the appropriate forum to have minimum rules on privacy legislation. But we've done that for trade agreements. We have provisions on environment and labor, but that's different because it's about making sure you increase trade, but in a sustainable manner. You want to make sure we don't pollute more oceans, we don't do overfishing, we don't facilitate trade in endangered species and all that. So I think I would really put privacy in a very different category. On your question on seclusion of markets, I think it seems so specific. I don't know the details of legislation in Germany on vitamins, so I'd rather not respond to that specific issue. I don't know enough about it. Thank you.
I guess just a couple of comments. In starting, I thought the question on privacy was a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer. I do know that the TPP has been criticized on both sides. Basically, what the TPP has done is they set a minimum standard and a kind of a mutual recognition. You can do privacy in one of these 6 different ways. So people who want stronger privacy say that's not sufficient. And people who say that privacy should have no situation in trade agreement said, well, you shouldn't put it in at all. So I'm not quite sure what the answer is. I mean, to Damien's point on privacy being a fundamental right, and look, privacy is incredibly important. I believe, please correct me, in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, security is a fundamental right. The right to work is a fundamental right. Almost life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in different words are all fundamental rights in Europe. So again, I'm not saying that means that privacy should be in trade agreements, but there are a lot of things that are very important, privacy among them. On this notion of just back to the advisory committee process and the whole question of how transparent these things can be. Again, I guess here just to echo what Damien has said, in the United, it's not like the agreement's negotiated and poof, it becomes law. In the United States, at least, Congress may decide to take it up. Maybe they won't take it up. If they do take it up, it's all going to be negotiated, or it's all going to be debated in public. There's complete opportunity. We've had meetings with representatives on Capitol Hill. Many folks at this table probably have on TPP and other trade agreements. And that's a process that's completely transparent and democratic. So I think the question of is there sufficient transparency needs to be separated from whether the process is undemocratic. At least in the United States, I think the process is fully democratic. I think it's open to question whether things can be done to increase transparency along the way.
I think that this is a story that has been echoed in Europe, and especially from Pascal Lamy, the former DG, who stepped into this saying that for the TTIP, in order for it to be negotiated, we need transparency because we're walking into issues that we haven't touched on before. Previously we have been discussing tariffs, and that's a question of protectionism. But when we go into regulation, it's really about precautionary measures. And in precautionary measures, consumers are going to be very worried, and they really want to take a look at this. So I think that has really driven Cecilia Malmström's effort to open up transparency. And then starting from that, they have put their whole Trade for All agenda out there, and it's increasing. So in terms of, I think and during this time, the U.S. has been very busy in negotiating the TPP, which is in that sense an old trade agreement, talking a lot about protectionism and not so much about regulation. So I think I'm optimistic that that's going to catch up. In terms of the German vitamins, I'd be happy to talk to you about those during the break. We can gather another round of questions.
Actually, to start off the next round of questions, we have a question from Twitter for Jeremy from Thomas Strains up in NYU. How do trade agreements such as the TPP interfere with ICANN multi-stakeholder domain name policy making?
Well, that's a good question, because it was a big surprise when we first got the leaked text of the TPP and found these domain name provisions in there. So what the domain name provisions are, there's one that says you have to have a domain name dispute resolution process that is similar to the one that ICANN has, and you have to also make the information of the people who register domain names available through a public directory. Now, these obligations apply to the national level domain registries, and we're not so familiar with those in the US because the .us is not very well used, but in other countries, the national domain registries are used a lot more than the global ones, so you have .ca for Canada, .au for Australia, and so on. Now, at the global level with ICANN, these obligations to make public the domain registration information and the dispute resolution processes are under reconsideration at the moment. And there's a big controversy about how public this information should be. And ICANN's actually thinking of scaling back the public accessibility of some of the information of domain name registrants. And yet, at the same time, we're trying to set those same obligations in stone in the TPP. And that's really inappropriate because there is a broad, open, multi-stakeholder process for developing these sorts of rules. And ICANN has those, and at the national domain name registry level, they also have those. So it was surprising and actually really quite contradictory to the US stated commitment to multi-stakeholder policy making that they actually put these in the TPP, and so that's a real concern going forward. We want to see, I'd like to have like an explanation from the USTR as why they thought they couldn't actually do this through the more open consultative multi-stakeholder processes.
If I can add to that, just to explain, actually, because we are all for transparency, right? But what are the problem here of making that publicity a rule in a lot of countries? There is actually a lot of concerns with privacy, and we have a lot of examples of the publication of names and owners of certain domains being actually threatened and even killed in certain countries. So if you think about certain countries that are not democratic, and you see all what happened a lot with journalists, and it's US, the freedom we have in US, you don't have in a lot of countries, including in Brazil. There are a lot of critics to politicians that you actually are prosecuted if you say something, right? So what ICANN is trying to do is privacy by proxy. So you have these intermediaries, then you do have information on who is in the intermediary in a certain URL, but you don't have the information of the actual individual. So just to understand why this is also this is important.
All right, we're going to start. Danny, you had no? Didn't you? We have a sort of set here.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name again is Rosemary Sekero. I'm a president of a non-profit and a profit organization. Thank you so much, Nicholas. Kuku has been my teacher I came from Africa. I didn't know how to use computer. I didn't know how to read things. But through Google, I can do everything on computer, even build a computer, even make a computer. So thank you so much. I work with small businesses in Kenya and other African countries. So I want to make them like me. So to use internet and to do business on the internet. Looking at Tamil, I thank you for incorporating everybody, the civil society, the businesses, and the actors. The other thing we need to include is the actual people who are the participants, the small businesses, the other people. Because here in America, small business is recognized, but in Africa, when they talk about small business, it's the biggest company. The other small companies I'm talking about who have no access to financial, who have no access to computer, to technology, are not recognized. Those are the people I'm representing. So we need to have them to have their story. So include me on your database whenever you have events and stories. So that I'm their participant, I'm their talker, I'm their representative. So thank you so much for all the work. So how do we make this happen? We need to be on the table. Thank you.
I'm not so sure that was a question, but it's done now, so.
I was just gonna say something. Thank you so much for your comments, but we really want to have questions right now, so make sure you ask a question.
Thanks very much for the panel. Terrific discussion. I wanted to ask a question, particularly in regard to Damien's observation that privacy is a fundamental right in Europe. And it certainly is a kind of human right that we've seen in universal declarations from the United Nations, et cetera. And so I think we can, even if we understand it, however, as a fundamental right, does that mean that we necessarily say that because it's a fundamental right, we shouldn't be having any international rulemaking about it? It would seem to me that if it's a fundamental right, we should actually think very hard about making sure that we include it in the frameworks, in the international frameworks. That if we believe it's a fundamental right, that we want to make sure it's protected around the world. And so that would be the impulse. And so think about other fundamental rights. We have a right to kind of clean water, or food that's healthy, et cetera, right? That's not going to poison us. Those issues are actually in trade agreements. Trade agreements have been dealing with healthy food and clean water and products that don't explode for a long time. And just because it is so fundamental, it actually means that we should be thinking about it in all our kind of rulemaking.
So thank you. My name is Daniel Crosby, and I'm a lawyer. I manage the office of King & Spalding in Geneva. And don't mean to pile on Damien, but let me. So just to share a perspective from Geneva in Washington to a European. Non-controversially, privacy is an exception under all trade agreements. It's not a rule, and you don't have a right to it. You first of all have a right to trade. And actually, the Kommerskollegium in Sweden recently did a series of papers relevant to our end of trade discussion that if you no transfer, no trade, no transfer, no production, when you have a commitment to allow trade to happen, there is attendant to that an obligation to allow data to move in relation to that trade, especially in services. So back to Anupam's point, if there's a right to trade and move data, which there is, invoking exceptions for privacy, like the data shield is an exception, it's not a rule, it becomes all the more important to explain to people who, especially those who don't have the political power and negotiating leverage that the EU has, to understand how they can invoke such exceptions under trade agreements to protect privacy. And by avoiding the discussion of privacy at the international level, we make it very hard for people to understand how they can invoke and protect those principles. And that raises even a greater concern, I think, and from a civil society perspective, that you leave it to each individual case to try to fight it out rather than having a clear standard that what the EU is doing in its privacy shield is legitimate and right and should be copied. And maybe that's not true, but there should be a standard that people know is going to survive challenge and not raise the concerns that we all have about privacy. So my question why do you not want to set a standard that everyone can follow to make sure that data can be moved and that we can have exceptions that we can rely on?
My name is Diane. Thanks for your presentation. I'll try to make it short. I don't know if you can understand all this system problem. Now, TPP is, in a nutshell, it's not really disclosed to the public until the real last minute. Now it's both union workers and presidential candidates, especially Democrats, they all oppose TPP. And then for PPP, although it's workable, the problem is a lot of time it's fraudulent. So I just wonder, on behalf of 99%, how do you explain all those and resolve the problem for the best interest of general public, both in the United States and overseas in the other countries?
Okay. Any last questions? Last collection here? Want to jump on the wagon real quick? We have one over there. Have a winner in the corner.
You gave me the opportunity, so I might as well take it.
Yeah,
go. Thomas Whitehead with British Telecom. Going all the way back to Sandy's very first comment, trade is obviously very poisonous in the U.S. political environment and elsewhere. I wonder if we're not shooting ourselves in the foot by referring to these issues as digital trade issues. I mean, I've got a trade law background, and I find them attractive for that reason. But I was wondering if you think that there's a potential downside to this when most people consider the internet very popular and want more of it, as Nick said.
You want to go left to right again? Collect this way?
Sure, just really quickly on yours. So I opened the TPP text, because now it's public, to actually read the language on personal information protection. You are right that they actually are not using the word privacy anymore, just in footnotes, to clarify what personal information protection means. And the clause that says shall adopt or maintain is actually obligatory, so it creates hard law. And the other clause, number 314A3, says shall endeavor to adopt non-discriminatory practice. That is actually is a, how do you say, like a commitment, something to aim for. So they do have different ways and weights in terms of how you're going to implement them. So I would not put that, and I let you give your perspective with Damien, but I don't see them as one exception of another, because actually if we saw the data, if the consumer do not trust on technology and do not trust on the platforms they are using, they will not use that platform, and then the digital trade will not happen. And to see what's happening now in the US with Microsoft, Apple, and all those folks that are positioning themselves as privacy enablers and sustainers, has a way to even differentiate themselves in the market, just shows that privacy is not exception. Privacy needs to be part of the game, security needs to be part of the game. So I just want to be clear that by the language and by consumer expectations, privacy is not exception. And just to be clear that PK, we are not against at all trade agreements or trade, but we want to be sure what is the language and how to implement that language and how to balance the public interest with the rest of the interests. Anyway.
So just to be clear, in response to this question, are you saying that you support a standard of privacy in trade agreements? In other words, it should go beyond aspirational language and establish a floor.
I think his question, I don't know that his question was that one. His question is privacy is or should be an exception, or he was putting privacy as an exception, and I'm just contradicting that affirmation, saying no, it's not. It's actually a rule. And from a perspective of even a consumer, I want my privacy. Like I do e-commerce since like 98. So I'm buying like in everything online since '98, and I do use AliExpress a lot nowadays. So for me to do that, I need to trust that they're gonna deal with my data correctly. So yeah, maybe some standard. I don't know if US is gonna like that, and now that we have security and cybersecurity in the pile, things got even more complex. So
from EFF's position, we don't want to see the details of,
Yeah.
of privacy standards in trade agreements, but there can certainly be a line that says each party shall have a data protection regime, and then flesh that out in a different context than a trade agreement. Sort of on the same topic, the question from the gentleman from BT, the problem with these big omnibus trade agreements is that if you throw all of these digital issues there, along with the agriculture and the everything else, then it's going to stand or fall based on issues that are not even relevant to you. Like, I mean, the TPP is going to stand or fall based on, 12 years protection for biologics and for the currency provisions or lack thereof, and the financial industry and stuff. They're not going to stand or fall on the copyright terms being life plus 70 years. And this is both a problem and also exactly the reason why these issues are dumped into trade agreements to begin with, because they want it to stand or fall on other more bigger, higher profile issues. They want to slip these digital things under the radar to some extent. But if we do want to pass digital rules, the other option that we have is to sort of disintermediate them and to put them into agreements that are a little bit more specific. That was what they tried to do with ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement. That's what they're trying to do with TISA, the Trade in Services Agreement. Now, both options have pluses and minuses, but at the moment, we don't want to see digital issues even going into these more specialised agreements because simply the process is not there. It's inconsistent with the multi-stakeholder model that I mentioned. But I think it is a good point that you make that, like, do we want to call these trade issues? They're really not trade issues. Why don't we deal with them in separate agreements? And actually, there's a lot of merit to that.
Not too much to add. I think the idea that Jeremy puts out of not negotiating the sort of intricacies of privacy provisions in trade, but thinking about broadly what kinds of requirements there should be is probably the right way to think about it. It's obviously very hard to address the flow of data without also addressing privacy and also encryption and a few other issues that have recently come up within TPP. And encryption actually appeared in the leaked TTIP text as well in a slightly abbreviated way from TPP. And I mean, obviously there's a question as to how far trade should go in general. Once you open the door to thinking about IP as part of trade, where do you stop? I'm not sure there's a clear sort of cutoff point, but yeah, as we think more about the role of trade agreements in supporting an open internet, I think some of these issues should be discussed at the very least.
Now, let's just clarify. I mean, I answered to a question whether we could compare environment and privacy, and I think I answered in that perspective. And if you read the Schrems judgment of the European Court of Justice, I mean, it's quite clear on the court's view what type of right we're talking about. And it doesn't mean that other rights are not fundamental rights, and I'm not talking about hierarchy of rights under EU constitutional law, if you want. I was just answering that question. And I think it's a political issue at this moment in time that data privacy, for a number of reasons, and I don't think we have time to go into that, is just too sensitive to include in a trade agreement. And I mean, I have here the resolution of the European Parliament, which we have to take into account and listen to extremely carefully. The views of stakeholders are important, but I think the view of the Parliament is as, if not more important, because ultimately they have to give their assent to any trade agreement. It's very clear that they say the trade agreement should not, and TTIP in particular, this is resolution on TTIP, should not affect the acquis, the existing and future acquis, I mean, which is basically the body of law, and it should be fully exempt. TTIP should fully exempt our legal framework for the protection of personal data from the agreement. So I think we'll see what the Commission comes up as with a text proposal. It's going to be public, so you'll be able to comment on it, and we'll see how we can further improve it. But I think at this stage, I do not expect the European Union or the Commission to make proposals on how to combine privacy and data flows and all that. That's where we are at this moment. Thank you.
Just a couple of brief comments to the question from the gentleman from BT. I guess those of us who think that trade is a good thing and more trade is a better thing are hoping that a lot of the rhetoric we're hearing in the presidential election is based on presidential electoral college politics. The most recent polls I've seen show that a majority of Democrats actually favor international trade and are supportive of international trade, which you would never hear from listening to the leading candidates on that side. So, maybe hoping against hope. I guess we'll see. We'll see what happens. And I guess just to close on pulling back what Nick had to say at the very beginning in his opening remarks, trade went beyond the trade of widgets decades ago. It's not, it's had IP in for a long, long time. It's had copyright in for a long, long time. If we're going to take the digital arena out of trade, we're taking the growth of the economy and a real engine for growth, both economically and I would argue freedom of expression. It's kind of funny, strange, not funny to me that we're sitting up here. I think generally we fall into a general agreement on thinking that certain things are good and certain principles are good, and we're fighting in many ways about details. Is it 70 years? Is it 50 years? Is it 60 years? Meanwhile, a lot of parts of the rest of the world aren't giving any of these kinds of things at all. And the more we fight about the details, I fear the more we're letting other actors who might not share these kinds of values really set the rules going forward. I think there's a real danger and delay.
All right, that wraps up our session, and we're heading out to the lunch and keynote with Susan, right? Susan Lund, and her report that I think we all have read and we've heard a lot of reference to in this room. I'm very much looking forward to that. So thank you, everyone here. Thank you, the organizers, for putting together this great setup. Thank you.